Hello, and welcome to the first part of this Blender Smoothie tutorial series on creating a Christmas tree in Blender. In this first part, we're going to be creating the actual tree itself. So we're just going to be using the Sapling add-on to create just a simple fir tree. And then in later parts of this tutorial series, we're going to be covering things like ornaments and lights and tinsel and the base of the tree and all these other things. So yeah, let's get started. Delete the cube first before we do anything else, and press Ctrl-Alt-U to open the user preferences, because the first thing we have to do is turn on the Sapling add-on. If you go to your add-ons tab, it should be towards the top right here. If it's not, just search Sapling and you'll find it that way. Click the little checkbox there to enable it, and close that, and press Shift-A, hover over Curve, and click Add Tree. So basically, of course, in case you don't already know, what the Sapling add-on does is it allows you to create trees directly within Blender without using external programs like Arboro. Okay, so we have a pretty typical tree here, at least a pretty typical deciduous tree. It has kind of the tend flame shape, it says right there. So it sort of looks like, almost like a candle flame of sorts. But we want, of course, a different shape for our Christmas tree, because Christmas trees are more conical than this shape. And we also need to move the branches down towards the base and all these other things. So, first thing we need to do, let's drag this up a little bit. You'll notice that we just have these really thin lines. Actually, they're infinitely thin lines, but these are basically just paths, or more or less just showing where the curves are supposed to go. If you were to render this right now, nothing would show up, because all it is scene data, essentially. So check the bevel box to bring some actual mesh, some actual geometry into the scene. Okay, it looks a little blocky in parts. As you can see on the branches, it's kind of there are some sharp transitions. It's not very smooth. We can change that by changing the handle type from vector to auto. And you'll see that that really helped a lot, smoothed all those out. We're also going to need to increase the bevel resolution, mostly because of this tree trunk here. As you can see, if you sort of go up towards top view a little bit, it's a square shape. It looks nice and smooth from this view, but it is only 4 faces all around. And it's going to look so-so when we render it. So we want to increase the bevel resolution a little bit to maybe 3, and you can see that's a lot smoother. It's a lot more circular. It affected the branches too, which will also make it look a lot nicer. So the next thing we need to do is change the shape, because obviously it's not quite right. You can see it starts out sort of the way we want it to, but then the branches curve inward towards the trunk. We want them to just keep extending out. So click on the shape here and select conical. And now we have the shape that we want. It starts out tapered and it slowly expands the closer it gets to the base of the trunk. Now the next thing we have to do is adjust how far the branches are from the base of the trunk, because right now they're really, really high up, at least in comparison to most Christmas trees. You'll want the branches pretty low typically. So we can change this by going to the branch splitting panel. And on the base size right there, you can see it says fraction of tree height with no branches. So right now, 40% of our tree doesn't have any branches. We want to lower that to maybe 0.1. Alright, maybe even a little lower than that. We could probably go down to 0.8. Yeah, that'll work. We don't want to get too close to the ground, because if you do that, then sometimes after you've added more branches and adjust the curvature and all these other things, you'll find that some of the branches on your tree are actually sinking into the ground below the base of the trunk, and that's definitely something that you don't want. Also keeping in mind that if we happen to have any extra tree trunk base or anything like that, we can always cover it up with the base of the tree that we're going to be creating in a later part of this tutorial series. So, okay. That looks pretty good. I'm actually going to add a couple more branches. Okay, a lot more branches, because it's kind of sparse right now. Maybe we can increase that to 100. There we go. Alright, so that looks pretty good. It's kind of leaning a little bit there, but that's okay. The branches are pretty thin in comparison to the trunk, though. Typically, they're not that thick in real life when you're comparing them to the thickness of the trunk, but they're not this thin either. This is pretty thin. I don't know if this could support the weight of all the needles and the ornaments that we'd be putting on it. So let's go back to, now it's right here, that's what I want to adjust. First you want to adjust this value right here, the branch radius ratio. Basically this just adjusts the ratio of the thickness of the branches to the thickness of the tree trunk. So the higher we set this, 1.5 maybe, the thinner the branches get in comparison to the tree trunk. And the lower we set this, maybe 0.75, the thicker the branches get. Now, that's a little too thick. You might want to do something like, something like 0.85 maybe. That looks pretty good. Maybe even 0.9. That'll work. Okay. Alright, so the next thing we can do is we can start adding levels to our tree. So basically, in case you haven't noticed, we have 2 levels right there right now, with level 1 being the tree trunk and level 2 being these main branches. I typically work with 4 levels on trees. It's a lot of levels, so it also depends on how much your computer can handle. People can typically get by with 3 levels just fine. But in this case, I'm going to be bumping it all the way up to 4, just to show you how to incorporate that better. And 4 levels is a little more realistic, just as far as the way the leaves are scattered on the tree and everything like that, or needles in this case. But you want to take 1 level at a time. So we'll start by bumping that up to 2 levels. And immediately you'll notice that all of these new branches are like, they're angled upward, and it looks really weird. It looks like there's this really powerful wind source or something right underneath the tree, and it's blowing all those little branches up. This is because the vertical attraction, which is actually in the branch growth panel, right there, is set to 0.5. Generally, you want this set to 0. Well, you may be thinking, well, why would you want it set to 0? Trees generally grow vertically, and the branches tend to be angled towards the sun. That's the way plants work. But actually a value of 0 on vertical attraction provides pretty natural looking results. If I could just show you by changing that to 0. You can see they're still primarily angled upward, but not quite so much as they were before. Yeah, and you can see a little bit, we already have 1 branch there kind of sinking below the tree trunk level, but we can clean that up a little bit later if we have to. So, looking at this, and I'm thinking the branches might actually be a little too thick, so I'm going to go back to branch splitting, maybe make that 1.1. Yeah, that looks a little better. Okay. Yeah, it's probably good for the second level. We're probably going to be going back and tweaking these a little bit more, just because we have to get the numbers of the branches on each level correct. Might be adding more of these branches on this level, maybe less, I don't know. We'll come back to it. So, now I'm going to increase the levels to 4. And the computer's kind of running a little slow right here. It's a lot of information to process. Really hope Blender doesn't crash on me. Okay, there we go. I will admit that's probably too many branches, though. We might want to lower this number to maybe 20. Gotta wait for that again. So it's really just a matter of, there we go, going back and editing the number of branches in each branch level until you have something that you're happy with. And it's also kind of hard to see that in advance when we don't have any leaves on the tree yet. But we're going to be adding those in just a second, and it should help a little more with that. So, I might even want to increase that to something like 12, just to add a couple more branches in the higher levels. right. Okay. So that's good for now. Let's move on to the leaves. So, click on leaves there. Before we do anything, don't click show leaves. That's a mistake that I often make. Blender's probably not going to crash if I do that, but because I'm starting out with so many leaves per branch, it might slow it down pretty significantly, and it could potentially crash too. You always want to start with a lower number of leaves, like maybe 2 or 3, and then work your way up once you've achieved the size and shape of the leaves that you want. Okay, now we can click show leaves, now that we have a pretty small amount of them there. It's still going to be a lot of leaves nonetheless, but... Okay, alright. And it looks terrible, because of course these don't look anything like pine needles, or fir needles, I guess, if this is a fir tree, not a pine tree. So, right now they look, they're little hexagonal shapes, which might be appropriate for more deciduous trees, but it doesn't work at all for coniferous trees. So, we need to change the shape, the type of the shape, and the shape itself of the leaf. So we're going to switch this to rectangular. There's also an advantage here because clearly rectangles have fewer vertices than hexagons, so it's going to make it a little faster as far as rendering goes. And now we want to adjust the size and the width of these, because right now they're just rectangles, like it says, but we want them to be a lot thinner than that and a lot smaller than that so that they look more like needles as opposed to giant rectangular leaves. So we'll start out by adjusting, can't remember which value it is. Okay, this value right here, leaf scale X. Can't see all of it. There we go. We want to lower this. We'll start out with maybe 0.2. See how that goes. Okay, so we're starting to get that shape that we're looking for. They're a lot thinner. They still don't look like pine needles. So I'm going to drop that even farther to maybe 0.05. Okay, that's a lot closer to what we want. Now, I will point out that we're probably going to have to make the needles a little thicker than they would be in real life. Just because if we make them as thin as they are in real life, we're going to have to add more of them to cover up some of the bare patches in the tree. And your computer may or may not be able to handle that. So that's another place where you've got to find the right balance between the size of the needles and the number of the needles, depending on what your computer can take. I think that's pretty good. Probably going to want to scale those down a little bit. Maybe make that 0.15. Okay, that looks pretty good. One other thing we have to remember to do while we're at this stage is change the leaf distribution. Right now, it's set to be distributed along a tapered cylindrical shape, which is not what we have. We have conical. So we need to change that to 0 there. It's going to wait a second or two. Okay. You don't really notice too much of a difference. It's mostly just because we don't have very many needles on there right now. So let's change that now, because we have pretty much everything set up. So I'm going to increase this to something like 15 to start with. It's probably not going to be enough, unfortunately, but we'll see how it goes. And again, hope that Blender doesn't crash on me. Okay, that looks pretty good, but they're still pretty sparse. Yeah, we're going to need a lot more than that. So we'll try 25. Taking quite a bit longer. Okay. yeah, it's a lot better. We'll notice that we do also have a bit of a problem in that there are a lot more pine needles on the top than there are at the bottom. That's something else that we're going to have to fix when we're cleaning up the tree a little bit after this. So right now the idea is to get the right number of needles in this main portion of the tree. Because clearly we have more than enough, actually probably too many up there at the top. But we're focusing on this portion because we can always go and remove some of the needles up there later on. So this is pretty close. I do think it needs a little more though, so I'm going to try 32. Alright. Of course, another option is always to make the needles a little thicker. But again, in this case, kind of like to keep them about the level of thickness that they're at, because we're already got it pretty close to accurate. I don't want to make them too much thicker because we want to keep that needle shape. But that's pretty good. In fact, I think that's good enough. You can still see a little bit of the tree trunk in there, but it's not that big of a deal. You're going to be able to see parts of that, and once we have it all lit, and we have all the Christmas tree lights and the ornaments and everything like that, you're not going to notice that. So, alright, at this point we're done with the sapling stuff. So we can drag that back over, move that back down. Fair warning, if you happen to select any of the parts of the tree at any point, if I do this now, and, okay, I guess that's not it, but if I select another object, for example, wow, the settings are staying. Alright, if I select this and press G to move it, okay, never mind. Before there was an issue with the Sapling add-on, that if you selected anything else in your scene or moved something in your scene, actually I didn't move it, I only right-clicked it, maybe if I, yeah, there we go. So if you move something in your scene, then you're going to lose everything that you had there on the properties panel. So if, yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. If you're still in the middle of your tree and you're not done yet, or you don't remember any of your settings or anything like that, just make sure that you don't move anything in your scene, and you keep working on the tree until you're done with everything that you have to do in the settings, because if you stop and do something else, you're not going to be able to continue the tree. It's just gonna be over right there. So now that we're done with the properties of the tree, we can start working on the shaders a little bit, and the cleanup work first, more importantly. So let's actually start with that. Okay, let me zoom in a little bit up here, and press tab to go into edit mode. It's running really slowly, that's a lot of needles. Basically what we need to do is we need to get rid of a lot of the needles in the top of the tree, because it's really, really heavily populated with needles, as opposed to the rest of the tree. So we really need to clean a lot of that up. What I found, the best way of doing that is to come down here to Select, and click Random. So now we've selected just random vertices. Actually, you know what? Press A to deselect, and we're going to switch to Face mode, so we can select random faces instead. That way we don't have to worry about there being half a needle. There wouldn't really be half a needle, it would just be an edge that wouldn't render, but we would get a lot of extra edges that would slow the computer down for unnecessary reasons. So click on Select, and select Random. Okay, now what we want to do is press C for Circle Select. Maybe expand that a little bit by scrolling out on the mouse wheel. And, oops, wrong button. You want to click and drag with the middle mouse button all of that area. And it is a pretty sharp transition between this part of the tree and the top. It's not really that noticeable, mostly just because there are so many needles there at the top. But if we start with something like that, and press Escape to exit that. And by the way, if you're selecting these needles and you're clicking and dragging with the middle mouse button, and then maybe you rotate your view and realize that there are still a lot of needles in the back that you haven't selected, make sure that you have this button here disabled. It's limit selection to visible. Basically what that means is you can only select what's visible in the view that you're in. If you disable that, then you can select everything in the back too and whatnot. So now that we have those selected, we can just press X to delete, and you can do vertices or faces, it doesn't matter. We're just deleting that selection. Alright, so that has cleaned it up a little bit. If you exit that and look at the top there, it's pretty good. Not nearly as dense as it was to begin with. You may actually want to do it one more time, especially right there at the top. So select random, and sorry about that, gotta zoom out a little bit. C for circle select, click and drag middle mouse button, and deselect all those. All the way up to this top part right here. It's really helpful to delete these, even if it doesn't really make that much of a difference visually, which I think it does, but even if it didn't, it'll delete a lot of these faces, and hopefully your computer will speed up a little bit. So again, delete. Okay, press tab to go back into edit mode, and believe we're done with the needles. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Alright, next thing we've got to fix are these branches that are extending below the base of the tree trunk. Honestly, think the best way to do that is just to extend the tree trunk a little farther. But before we can do that, you could do it, I guess, by editing the curve. But ultimately, we're going to be converting this to a mesh anyway, so we can unwrap it for the textures and whatnot. So we're just going to go ahead and do that now, convert it. Alt-C to convert, and click Mesh from Curve. And it should be a mesh now. So if you press Tab to go into edit mode, there we go. It's running really slowly because there are a lot of branches on here. So I'm just going to right-click one vertex on the tree trunk. Actually, we'll just hover over a vertex and press L. And that'll select everything that's linked to it. So now we've selected the entire tree trunk. I'm going to press Ctrl-I to invert my selection, and H to hide. So it should run a lot faster now, at least a little faster. All the needles are still there, I guess. We'll press B and drag a box around the bottom of that. And I'm just going to extrude it by pressing E and Z. Move that down. And I'm actually going to scale it out a little bit too, just so that there's a little bit of an expansion right there at the bottom. Okay. And we're going to be putting the base of the tree around that and everything. So, yeah. That is pretty much all we're doing as far as modeling the tree goes. So that's the end of the first part of this tutorial series. In the next part, I'm going to go over shading. Especially with the needle shader, because that's something a little hard to get right. Yeah, so that's it for this first part, and I hope to see you again in the next part. Thanks for watching.